dealing with discouragement. And years ago, I heard just kind of a tale of sorts. Talking about that the devil had decided to go out of business, and he was selling all of his tools. And there were all these tools spread out, and they were all of varying prices. And then there was an old tool that looked really worn out, and the price on it was more than all the other ones combined. And the question was asked, said, why is this old worn out tool the one that is the most expensive, more than all the others combined? And the devil said, he said, that is my oldest and most effective tool. He said, I have dragged more people away from the Lord with this tool than any other, and that is why it is the most expensive. And that tool was discouragement. The tool of discouragement. And we need to understand that discouragement is a tool of the devil. And that when we are discouraged as children of God, we need to understand that we don't need to look any further for the cause of our discouragement than the devil himself. And that the devil uses people, and he uses events, and he even uses life itself as a means to discourage God's people. And so I want us to think this morning about the matter of discouragement. And on the top of the next page, on page 45. And obviously this is true. We've just spoken of it. It says, discouragements may be caused by problems which arise at home, at school, at work, with friends. And then Christians, and this is what I was just talking about, Christians are not immune from financial problems. They're not immune from family problems. They're not immune from work or career problems or the many other problems that arise in human life. Christian couples have difficulties. Relatives and even relatives, spouses, children, parents sometimes do not act as we would like or as they should. Sickness can be very discouraging, and we want to remember that even though we are Christians, we are not immune from any and every discouragement that might befall any other human being on the face of the earth. The advantage, though, that we have is that we have the means to deal with discouragement. By the way, it is not a sin to be discouraged. I think sometimes Christians get discouraged and they think that somehow that there must be something wrong with them. Or that maybe if I'm discouraged, my faith isn't strong enough. My faith isn't what it should be. And by the way, that might be true. It might be that some of our discouragement is caused by our weakness, our own personal weaknesses, our lack of commitment to spiritual growth and development. But we also want to understand that we are not immune from these things. But as Christians, we have various tools at our disposal that help us to overcome discouragement. And so that's the thing we want to think about this morning. Now, looking at thinking about I'm going to go back to the top of the page, at the first full paragraph that begins with discouragement. Many Christians suffer discouragement because of financial situations. And sometimes those situations can be problems of our own making, right? Most people in this country make enough money to live. Right? But a lot of people don't make enough money to live like they want to live. There is more than $1 trillion in credit card debt in our country right now. $1 trillion of credit card debt. I think the number is somewhere around, it's like $7,000 or $8,000 for every single person in America that's toting some type of, or every adult that's toting some type of credit card debt. And and as I always tell you, if it's $7,000 or $8,000 for every single person, then somebody's got mine because I don't have any. And somebody's got Rhonda's because she doesn't have any. And people, and even Christians can be weighted down, be crushed by the burden of debt, and then those things can cause us to be discouraged. And when we get discouraged, we oftentimes look for somebody to blame, and oftentimes we don't look at the right person. And so we want to be mindful of that. But then there are other things that happen to us. For example, sickness. Sickness was offered up as a source of discouragement. And I'll just be honest with you. It's difficult for me to sympathize with a person who deals with sickness or pain a lot, because I've been very healthy all my life. I've been blessed. I mean, I realize that. People say, all that running you do, aren't you? You're killing your knees. You're wearing your knees out. You're wearing your hips out. And I'm like, you know what? Everybody I know that's had a knee replacement or hip replacement, none of them were runners. I don't know a single runner who ever had a knee replacement or a hip replacement. But sometimes you're just blessed with good health. There's no rhyme or reason to it. My dad, until he got cancer, but my dad was a very healthy person. My grandparents, generally speaking, except for my dad's mother, she enjoyed poor health all of her life. But I come from a line of healthy people, and so I haven't had to live with or deal with people that live in chronic pain. On the other hand, Rhonda's grandmother, her mom's mom, had the kind of arthritis that disfigures your fingers and your toes. I think she had 2 different surgeries to break her toes to get them straightened back out and put pins in them. Her fingers went in different directions, and it was a constant source of difficulty for her. And yet she was one of the most content, happy Christians I've ever known in my whole life. And so she didn't allow her physical ailments to discourage her. And so, but we want to understand, as Christians, these types of things that remind us that this world is not our home. Isn't that right? I mean, when we deal with sickness or injuries or disease or those types of things, it reminds us that there is a time coming when God will make everything right. I always tell y'all my favorite verse in all of the Bible about heaven is Revelation 21 and verse 4. Number one, God is there. God is there. I mean, He's like literally there. Now we know that God is with us in this assembly, but it's not in the same sense that we'll be with Him in heaven. But then you have verse 4 that talks about after God will be with them and be their God. Verse 3, God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There'll be no more death. Death will never cause separation for us in heaven. No more sorrow. No more crying. No more pain. For the former things are passed away. If you are a person who deals with sickness or chronic pain, look, this is an easy thing for me to say, but what I'm saying is, don't be discouraged. Don't be discouraged, because there is a time coming when God will make everything right. There'll be no crying, no death, no separation, no pain, no tears. That's where the song "No Tears in Heaven" really comes from, that we oftentimes sing. And so do not be discouraged. Then in this paragraph it talks about Christian couples have difficulties. One of the things I really enjoy doing as part of my work is going to the marriage retreat in the Pigeon Forge. And over the early session and the late session, I think there's about 500 or 600 couples there over the course of the weekend. And by and large, every single couple there, they're all Christians. And yet, when the speakers speak, you know what they talk about? They talk about troubles that Christian couples have. And by the way, and when they talk about those various types of troubles, whether it be financial or related to illness, we had one specifically on illness this year from Michael Clark that was outstanding. And it's probably available on PTP 365. I would encourage you to try to find that. Challenges, with regard to intimacy and all the challenges that people in the world face, Christians also face. And so as they talk about all these problems, you see, it doesn't matter how old or how young the couple is, you see them nodding their heads. They all, we all understand that all of these things befall us, even when we're trying to serve the Lord. All right. Second paragraph, full paragraph on page 45 says, discouragements may also come because of disappointments related to our service to Christ. Sometimes other members may appear to be hypocritical in their conduct. All right? Now look, sometimes it may appear to be hypocrisy, and sometimes it is hypocrisy. Let's be clear about that, right? How many of us have heard somebody say they don't go to church because because what's in the church? Hypocrites. I'm not going to go to church because there's hypocrites in the church. It's like, you really have two choices. You can either go to church with hypocrites or you can go to hell with them. And I can promise you this, church is a lot shorter period of time than hell. Is that right? Why would I let somebody else's hypocrisy keep me from doing what I know is right? By the way, just because I go to church with hypocrites, does that make me a hypocrite? If you go to a ball game with a hypocrite, does that make you a hypocrite? If you go fishing with a hypocrite, does that make you a hypocrite? If you go golfing, you go shopping, whatever it is, if you do these things with it, if you have to work with, whoever quit their job that they really needed because, somebody at their place of employment was a hypocrite. And when I say a hypocrite, I mean like profess to be a Christian, but they come in on Monday talking about their weekend and like there wasn't a whole lot of church talk involved. And so, I'm not going to allow someone else's hypocrisy keep me from doing what I know that I'm supposed to do. Let me give you an example of this from the scriptures, okay? Quick quiz. Who did Jesus condemn the most during his ministry on earth? What group of people? What group of people? Pharisees. Thank you, Terry. The Pharisees. They were the number one source of the Lord's criticism throughout his entire ministry. By the way, do you know what name he called them more than any other name? Hypocrites. Scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites. Matthew 23, man, it's like over and over and over again. Jesus is talking about the Pharisees, and he calls them hypocrites. But here's what else you need to understand. Here's what else he said about the Pharisees. whatever they tell you to do, you do it. Did you hear that? Whatever the hypocrites tell you to do, now he didn't say it that way, he was talking about the Pharisees, but he called them hypocrites, so I can use that terminology, right? Whatever the hypocrites tell you to do, you do it. He says, but do not do like they do. In other words, do as they say, but not as they do. So what do we learn? We learned that what the Pharisees, by and large, were telling people to do was what? Was what? It was right. So, did Jesus exempt people from doing right because hypocrites told them to do it? No. So whatever they tell you to do, you do it. Now, whatever they do, now don't do what they do. But whatever they tell you to do, you do that. So the same thing goes for us, right? If there are hypocrites in the church, then if whatever they, obviously they're hypocrites because they profess one thing and they do another thing, right? So whatever a hypocrite in the church may profess, it's still right, isn't it? Even though the person who is professing it doesn't live it. Right? And so we're not going to allow ourselves to be discouraged by hypocrisy in the church. All right, but now let me go to the point that's trying to be made in the book. It says sometimes they may appear to be hypocrites. And that's an important distinction to be made. Right? Because look what the book says. It says, it may be the case that they, like you, are fighting Satan's intrusion into their lives. In other words, here's a person. Let me just back up one step. Do we know everything that's going on in everybody else's life? We do not, do we? Not even close, right? Not even close. We don't know anything to speak of that's going on in somebody else's life. So therefore, we don't know what Satan might be doing to them, right? We don't know what Satan, how Satan has slithered in, to their life, and the type of pain he's inflicting on them, and that they may be having a really hard time dealing with whatever it is, that Satan, just look. If you've ever, if you've lost a spouse, that's an unbelievably difficult thing to handle, right? Now let me ask you a question, and I'm not asking for an actual answer. But to those of you that lost a spouse, were you always at your best in the first? And I'm just going to pull a number out of the hat, okay? Were you always at your best the first 6 months after you lost your spouse? No. Could your difficulty in dealing with the loss of your spouse be misinterpreted as hypocrisy? And by the way, what we're talking about right now is going to come back, Lord willing, in the second part of our sermon series this morning. And so I'm not at my best. You could have lost a spouse. You could have lost a spouse to death. You could have lost a spouse to divorce. You could have lost a child. You could be dealing with unbelievable pressures at work. Your marriage might be in a bad place. And any of those things, or sickness, how many times I get mad at some of y'all sometimes when you don't tell me when you're sick. And look, I understand some of you are very private people, and I appreciate that. But if you don't let us know what's going on, you know what we can't do? We can't pray. We can't help, right? Just because you're sick or you're going through some difficulty and you want to hold it to yourself, you are losing out on one of the greatest tools to overcome that discouragement, and that is the love and the prayers and the help of your church family. Is that right? I'm going to have a hard time telling this. I heard a boy about 9 years old yesterday when in Owen and Huxton's section of speech. Little old boy, he came to Lads from Hawaii. All right? He lives in Hawaii. He came to Lads. He gave a speech. And by the way, the whole theme of Lads this year was God meant it for good. Genesis 50 and verse 20, where Joseph is speaking to his brothers, because his brothers are scared to death because they knew they did him dirty. And Joseph's like, you intended it for evil, but God meant it for good. All right? So that's another way we can help us overcome discouragement, is to have the faith that whatever we're going through right now, God intends it for our good. This little boy got up and he gave his speech. And he talked about how his little brother got brain cancer. And that last March, his 9-month-old brother, and these are his words, went to glory. And he said, you might be wondering, how can my baby brother dying be meant for good? And he said, this is a 9-year-old kid. He said, because our church family prayed for us, they offered us financial assistance, they brought us food, they helped us every step of the way. Every step of the way. And I'm just back there bawling. And I wasn't the only one either. Fallon was crying and Bianca was crying. But it was such a powerful statement coming from this little guy. And so, when we withhold our discouragements from our brethren, we withhold ourselves from one of the greatest tools that we have at our disposal to overcome discouragement. And so, sometimes the difficulties that we have in our lives may manifest themselves in ways that it appears to be hypocrisy on our part, but when in fact, we're literally fighting for our spiritual lives, right? And so, let us not be too quick to judge somebody as being a hypocrite, when we run across them on one of their worst days. I don't want to be remembered by anybody on one of my worst days. Is that right? Who does? Who does? And so we want to be careful that we don't judge somebody's spiritual struggle or whatever struggle it is that they're having as hypocrisy. Let's see here. Let's go to the third full paragraph. Begins with then there. Then there is the possibility of being disappointed with yourself. Man, and that one really gets on me. When I let myself down because I know I've let the church down or I've let the Lord down. But it comes back to me, right? I'm disappointed in myself that I didn't do better, and now because I didn't do better, that's a reflection on my church family, and it's a reflection on the church in general and the God that I profess to serve. A number of things. You may not have grown in knowledge as fast as you expected. You may have found it hard to deal with particular weaknesses. Again, just because you become a Christian doesn't mean that that the Lord has put some type of shield around you that's going to automatically quench all of Satan's darts. When you become a Christian, the temptations that you had to do wrong before you were a Christian, they're still going to be there. But you fight them and you overcome them. But you also overcome them understanding that there's been some other ones in the background that you really weren't that aware of because you were fighting this one. And now that you've overcome this one, another one rears its ugly head. But that's just the nature of the Christian life. There's always going to be spiritual battles to be fought. All right? And so, disappointed in self. I found it hard to deal with certain weaknesses. Look, we ought to be disappointed in ourselves if our failures are because of sin. But even this should not allow to be discouraging us to the point of giving up. Instead, we ask for forgiveness and determine never to give up in our efforts to live for God. Now, we have some passages here on the bottom of page 45, bottom half of 45. We'll walk through some of these. Romans 8 and verse 28 does not say that all that happens will be good, but that God will cause everything to work out what? Yeah, for good or for purpose. For good or for purpose. Again, that goes back to our lad's theme. You meant it for evil, Joseph said, but God meant it for good. And by the way, if you're not familiar with the story of Joseph, what happened was his brothers sold him into slavery because they were jealous of him. They hated him. The Bible says they hated him. Couldn't even speak to him. They hated him so much couldn't even talk to him. And he got sold into slavery and then rose to the top with Potiphar and then ended up in jail because Potiphar's wife lied on him. And he spends a number of years in jail. And then he's restored back to Pharaoh, and then he's essentially second in command over all of Egypt. And because he's serving God, God reveals some things to him about years of plenty and years of famine. And Joseph exercises wisdom. They store up enough food to not only feed themselves during the famine, but also to sell their grain to others. And some of those others that came to buy grain were Joseph's family because the famine was over in the promised land too. And so they came over to buy grain and they didn't even recognize their own brother. But he knew them immediately. And then there's that whole exchange there in Genesis 39 and following. But the point is that Joseph was able to see past the terrible thing that they had done to him and the terrible things that had happened to him because of that. And then at the end, see, you know what? All this ended up being for a reason. My brothers are not going to starve to death. My father is not going to starve to death. The 75 people that lived in his father's household were not going to starve to death. All these things that happened that were evil, God meant them for good. Philippians 4, verses 6 to 7. It says, careful. The word there is anxious. I mean, the text says careful, but what that means is filled with care. Okay? It says be anxious or careful for what? Nothing. It says, but everything by prayer with supplication, let your requests be made known to God, and the peace of God that passes all understanding will keep your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus. So we're not to be overcome with worry or anxiety. I was talking to somebody, I can't even remember who it was. In my gospel meeting at Arnold a couple of weeks ago, I was having a study with a lady, and she talked about having brain cancer. She had a brain tumor in the front part of her brain, and she said when she went into surgery, her husband's not a Christian, and as she went into surgery, her husband's like, how is it that you are not nervous? How is it that you are not afraid? How is it that you are not scared? And she says, I've got the Lord. I've got the Lord. She said, I'm going to go into surgery, And either the Lord will come out with me, or I will go out with the Lord. You think, man, that's the peace of God that passes all understanding. And I'm thankful that she lived so that she could tell me that story. And I can share it with you. Either the Lord will come out with me, or I will go out with the Lord. So Philippians 4, 6 to 7. Galatians 6 and verse 9 says that we are not to be, says, do not get tired of doing what is right. It says, so we're not to grow weary in well-doing. It says, for we shall what in due season? Reap in due season if we faint not. The idea of reaping is that there is it's an agricultural illustration. The guy just doesn't get to plant and leave it, right? I mean, there are things that have to be done between the course, of prepping the ground and planting the seed. There are a lot of things that have to be done before the time of harvest. You may get tired of that hoe handle, right? You may get tired of it. But if you want to reap, what you got to do? You got to keep using it. You got to keep working. We will reap in due season if we do not faint. And so there's the picture there. Of course, then 1 Corinthians 10:13 teaches us, that God will never let any temptation be too much for us to bear. Because with every temptation, He provides a way of escape that we might be able to bear it. Okay, so the idea of overcoming discouragement is very important for the child of God. All right, we'll close this one out. Lord willing, next week we'll go to day 31.